Everybody, welcome to the Daily Objective. We're interviewing a former prosecuting attorney in the United States or in a particular district. We'll find out in just a moment. Please leave a like and send in your super chats with questions and comments ASAP. And please welcome historian, intellectual, and former prosecuting attorney, James Valliant.
Oh, thank you, Rucka. How you doing?
Pretty good. So I learned of your past life at some point since you've been on the internet, and I've always wanted to ask you some questions. So here we are. So anyone who's living in today's context needs to sort of wrestle with their conscience at one point or another, I would think. So if you're in the private sector, in many industries, you at some point need to sort of cooperate with the government in some way. And even if you're not in those particular industries, you're still dealing with certain tax incentives or tax something or another, regulations or lack of regulation, which gives you an advantage over a different business. There are times in the private sector when you're sort of unable to just follow your moral conscience. You need to live with the mixed economy we live in. That's the private sector. Then when it comes to let's say working as a politician, going into politics, let's say running for office or working for a campaign, you in today's context, you need to basically compromise in some way. If you're going to be a Republican, you basically need to work with candidates that are anti-abortion, or if you're working with the Democrats, you need to, hold your nose and go along with all types of terrible laws that they are going to pass. Now, when it comes to being a prosecuting attorney, I would think you really need to basically go against your own moral beliefs, because you're now being called upon to enforce laws that should not be on the books, in addition to laws that are properly on the books. So there's kind of my introductory monologue. So I guess, what was it like? How long were you a prosecuting attorney? I guess there's a good question. What years?
I went from, it was from 1989 to 2007. So for almost 18 years, I was a public prosecutor. I was a deputy district attorney for the county of San Diego, the state of California. And in the course of that time, I prosecuted many murder cases, rape cases. I became a sort of a specialist in rape cases, child abuse cases. I even did some appellate work. I found the work very, very rewarding. Most objectivists would believe that most of the there'd be distasteful moments like that. And of course, all objectivists agree that a great deal of our legal system is invalid. Not only isn't it a protection of individual rights, it's a violation of individual rights. Now, anytime you're a government lawyer, you're going to have a different ethical, as you just pointed out, position than the poor private sector person who's just trying to cope with what the laws are throwing at them. They are in a far more innocent position when they have to do that, it seems to me, than the government lawyers who are actually agents of prosecuting what are, in many cases, just downright evil laws. Now, most of those happen at the federal level. For example, antitrust monopoly laws. That's the federal Justice Department, mostly. Say tax enforcement from the IRS, immigration enforcement, insider trading rules from the SEC, environmental protection rules. Those kind of laws that most of fans of Ayn Rand would think are just downright evil laws are done at the federal level. And I had opportunities to work in the private sector. I had opportunities to work for the federal government and these regulatory agencies. I opted against all of that on purpose. I do not think that one can be an objectivist with integrity and spend your life enforcing securities and exchange laws or tax laws. I just think that's inherently wrong for an objectivist to even take on that job. Now, as in the state and local level, that's where we do the prosecution of laws that are, at least in large part, laws that objectivists would agree with. Laws against murder, theft, assault with a deadly weapon, kidnapping, rape, vandalism. actual physically coercive violations of, which are actual violations of individual rights. Most of that is done at the state and local level. And that is why intentionally, I chose to be a government lawyer at that level. I wanted to be the guy in court and doing the fun stuff in court. And most private attorneys rarely get a chance to get inside court. They're negotiating contracts and trying to keep their clients out of court. Then I wanted to be the guy, the Perry Mason, having fun in court, pointing the finger and getting the bad guy, which I did find actually more emotionally rewarding and challenging, and a wonderful job. I loved the job in many ways. But of course, even at the local level, the DA level, there are crimes which objectivists would very much object to. There's still economic crimes, zoning violations, say, and there's certainly still all the whole range of drug laws. I think the drug laws are a bloody, immoral mess, and drugs should be legalized. For example, the fentanyl deaths occurring in America today are a direct result of the illegality of fentanyl, not the use necessarily. People are often getting things they think are not fentanyl, and it's being poisoned with fentanyl. If it was legal, of course, it would be as safe as buying aspirin at the drugstore. And so, because you'd know the quantity, you'd know what's in there. But as a baby DA, in my first couple of years as a DA, when you're getting training, you have very little choice as to it. You just sort of have to do preliminary hearings or get your training in how to issue criminal cases, and you're dealing with all those cases. And so I had very little choice at the beginning. But once you get to be a sort of respected, experienced, more senior DA, and it happened relatively early for me, thank goodness, you get to focus on what area, what unit within the DA's office you specialize in. So I could say, give me the domestic violence unit, where unfortunately most of the murders happen, or assign me to the child abuse unit, where all we do is child abuse, physical, sexual, or neglect cases against children, or the appellate division. I love doing appellate work, and there I had some choice as well. So very shortly, I found I was able to specialize in things which kept me doing only the kind of crimes I thought were appropriate to prosecute.
That's interesting. I always assumed that as a prosecuting attorney, you take whatever crime is being alleged. Like, so one day it could be a marijuana possession charge, and another day it could be a murder. Like, I didn't think you could be in a particular division.
Well, most prosecutors don't have the same kind of moral qualms that I do about certain laws. And so they were happy to take any case that came their way. And there are general pool units where you can just do that. I wanted to go San Diego, believe it or not, is the 6th largest metropolitan area in the United States. So we had a relatively large district attorney's office. When I was there, a couple of hundred DAs worked for the elected district attorney. Now they had different functions and roles as her agents, assistants or deputies or something. And I was a deputy district attorney acting in court for the elected DA. But so large an office, though, we have to have specialized units: a major violators unit, a child abuse unit, a domestic violence unit. And for example, the murders happen from someone you know. It's usually not stranger murder. So believe it or not, the majority of murder cases are generated from the domestic violence unit, a unit, therefore, I signed up for because I wanted to do a bunch of murder cases, if that makes sense. So yeah, we have specialty units, and the sooner you gain the confidence of your boss, the sooner you'll be able to choose the specialized unit you get into. And I was relatively quickly able to do that.
Okay. Do you think the court system runs basically honestly and fairly? Having been inside of it, do you think there's a lot of corruption? Like, how would you answer that if you could?
I would say it's mostly, at the level that I was doing it, it was mostly not corrupt. I think that, and here I'm going to make a general principle, the less media attention a criminal case got, the happier I was, because the jury would be learning about it all inside court and only from court, not from the media, and not the huge public opinion that would be generated around it. Every time the local news cameras came in or a local newspaper reporter came in to talk to me, I would try to duck under the desk and avoid the media. But if you can't avoid the media, then there are still ways to go to make it work. But even in the big media cases lately that we've had, I'm actually relatively pleased across my country, even recently since I've left the DA's office, with the jury outcomes. There are a couple of exceptions to that, obviously, but I have great confidence in the American jury system. Now, there are a lot of rules and procedural things that are difficult to work with and that I just sort of had to swallow. Take, for example, the exclusionary rule in evidence in America. The Supreme Court has said, the United States Supreme Court has said that if a cop, the police officer, in investigating the case or arresting the defendant, violates the Constitution, the evidence is now inadmissible. It can't come in at trial if the cop violated the Constitution. Now, in many of those cases, the cop acted perfectly innocently. He didn't know he was, the case may go up on appeal and a 3-judge panel may be divided 2-1 after months of argument. So how is the cop on the street in the immediate moment supposed to know what the proper thing to do is if appellate judges, after months of consideration, disagree among themselves? And so sometimes, and very frequently, the cop is acting perfectly innocent. It has no effect on the reliability of the evidence. And so I oppose the exclusionary rule as it exists today. Why should the murderer get off? Why should the victim have to suffer because of some innocent mistake by the cop, even if it technically violated the Constitution? Or even if it's not an innocent mistake and it affects the quality of the evidence, there are other ways of sanctioning the cop. We can fire the police officer. We can suspend him without pay. We could fine him. We could criminally prosecute him. But rather than do the sanctions against the cop for doing the wrongdoing, which would measure how willfully wrong he was doing it and so forth, we take it out on the case with the exclusionary rule. So I oppose that procedural rule, but I had to just swallow it. I just had to live within what I thought was a bad procedural rule, and that you just can't avoid. You just have to swallow bad law, work within it. I am not the maker. As a prosecutor, I do not make the laws. I enforce the laws of my state as they exist. And I kept that firmly in mind. It is not my opinion that I'm enforcing. I'm enforcing justice as I see it, protecting victims from force, from physical force, but within the parameters of the existing law. Best way I have of describing it.
Do you think an objectivist, like so someone who agrees with you philosophically, but happens to work as a defense attorney, could come to very different conclusions than you, whether it's about how smooth the system runs? Like maybe a defense attorney thinks it's much more stacked against the suspect, you know, the alleged criminal, or maybe a defense attorney, again, who agrees with you on in principle, but they could honestly come to the conclusion that these procedures are there for a reason. And so if the police don't follow proper procedure, the evidence should be thrown out, because as bad as the crime was, as heinous as it is, that's how badly we need police to follow procedure, or else we are in a bordering on anarchy. So, you know, to be a little hyperbolic.
Many, many, many times. I don't like the exclusionary rule as it exists, but as a prosecutor, I was always arguing when they had motions to exclude the evidence. I was always on the side arguing, bring the evidence in. I'm the prosecutor. The defense attorney saying, oh no, the cop did wrong, keep that evidence out, judge. I understood their motives. I understood they were working with an existing law. And I even understood it when they were saying, hey, this cop did something wrong. Part of me felt actually sympathy when they would say, so yeah, there you could have perfectly reasonable differences of opinion, but actually share similar values with defense attorneys. In several cases, I had nothing but sympathy for the position of the defense attorney, even as I was arguing against it. Many defense attorneys, believe it or not, shared my basic perspective that the government should be kept to, should keep their fire to the feet, make sure the government is doing things properly. And even when they had guilty clients, they would say to me, well, wait a minute here. I still want to keep the government on its toes. I still want to make you guys jump those hoops and prove it, because if you don't prove it in even those cases against the guilty, then it'll happen to the innocent. And that's how they saw it. And they weren't trying, in some of those defense attorneys weren't just trying to get someone they knew to be guilty off just because I want to get everybody guilty off. They were just trying to make it as fair as possible for their client. And those defense attorneys I respect and have utmost respect for. And the respect was mutual, by the way. I had a reputation among judges and defense attorneys of being honest, straightforward. I would always disclose the discovery, the information as soon as I got it. I was always going by the rules. And so I had a good, don't mean to boast, but I had a good reputation for integrity from the defense bar and the bench. But I would also, and it's a hard balance to strike, also had a good reputation within law enforcement, the cops and the prosecutors, because when I did pursue a case I believed in, I was ruthlessly mad dog aggressive. I wouldn't want to negotiate a lesser sentence. And so, but it's a difficult balance to achieve. But absolutely, I had respect for defense attorneys. I think they can do their job morally. I think there are also defense attorneys who are not so moral, and they are just trying to get criminals off, people they know who are guilty. And I could detect that in many cases. And those were always the ones you never turn your back on.
Now, the sort of civil liberties community of the times we live in, they tend to, they might hear what you're saying and say, look, a lawyer's job is not to have a moral opinion. A defense attorney's job is to protect their client, and a prosecutor's job, should be to ideally to follow the actual law and sort of prosecute, but not to be corrupt and not to lie about the situation. But definitely, they would say when it comes to a defense attorney's job is to protect their client from getting put into a cage. And so from an objectivist perspective, I could see how, you would say, no, ethics are everywhere, but at the same time, we want to follow rule of law. We don't want to have, particular individuals, dictating.
Well, if the law is the law, both sides just have to buck. I mean, there were many times where I would win the case on some legal point, the argument on some legal point, as we're approaching trial, and the defense attorney simply had to swallow it. Okay, you won, and I'm probably not going to win on appeal on that point. The law is just the law. We just sort of have to submit. And the same was true on my side. There was times when I had to just, okay, well, that's the way the law is, and I just have to submit. And we can't substitute our own. Like I say, we are just the executive enforcement of the law that exists, and the law as it exists. And we have to work within that law. Now, working within that law still gives a huge range of moral options. And I mean a huge range of moral options as to how you proceed. I can very much distinguish ethical prosecution from unethical prosecution. As I say, it's part of the code of a lawyer's ethics that he or she cannot take a case that they don't believe in. If I don't believe that this case, just morally, I'm sorry, and there were times I went to my boss and I said, find someone else. You might be able to find another prosecutor who do this, but I cannot do this morally from my own perspective. And the boss always said, okay, Jim, I understand. There's someone, like, we won't prosecute it, or I'll assign it to someone else. I'll take your considerations into account. And all kinds of optional choices too in how you prosecute, all sorts of optional choices in that. And they're always ethical. There's no way to avoid ethics in every single one of our decisions. And I'd go all the way back to deciding being a prosecutor. What level? Am I going to be a tax prosecutor for the feds, or am I going to prosecute murder cases on the local level? Or even within that, am I going to utilize some aspect of the law because I think it would be just and appropriate here? Or am I not? Am I going to strategically not use that? There are all kinds of options on both sides, and all of those questions boil down to an ethical question. You cannot avoid questions of ethics in any human choice.
Mm-hmm. Is your view of the police generally positive, at least as far as the districts where you served? A lot of people see the police as very corrupt. And
I do not see the police as mostly or inherently corrupt. I see most of them as actually, where they disagree with me, say, about drug laws, they honestly believe in the drug laws. And that's, they may not have thought it through, They may not be very principled or philosophical. Most people aren't very philosophical. They're mixed bags. They take the ethics as they accept it from by osmosis from their surrounding culture or religion or whatever. But I think they were sincere in most cases. You don't take an underpaid, physically dangerous job where, at 2 a.m. you're sent out to separate a bloody drunk couple that are fighting, or just simply to get spat on and be called dirty names. It is a thankless, dangerous, unpleasant job on a routine. Just do a few ride-alongs with cops, and you'll see that 99.9% of their work is dangerous, unpleasant, unrewarded, and certainly these days, thankless job. They get spat at and called names or shot at. So no, most cops, I think, are there for very, in their minds, principled ethical reasons. They're doing it to protect their community. Now, of course, are they human beings? And here I would include both truly immoral people who are being irresponsible as cops, and there are. Cops tend to be on the conservative end of the political spectrum, and with all the minuses and some of the pluses that go with that. And so the attitudes they brought oftentimes colored the way they did their job. And I was always having to fight that. Now, and there were times, even as a prosecutor, where I'm normally on the cop side. I mean, I had to, after one closing argument, I woke up to the local paper's headline the next morning: prosecutor accuses cop of lying, which I had to do in a closing argument because I'm there to do justice. So I'm perfectly aware that cops do sometimes lie, plant evidence, because they get sometimes so bitter about the system. Or let's take the other end, an innocent case where the cop just is wrong but sincerely believes in something. All of that happens, to be sure. So bad things happen from cops. And certainly in some places, those sheriffs in those more rural districts or southern areas of our country, I wouldn't trust them as far as I could throw them in some cases because of pre-existing bigotry. Less so about race these days than other reasons. This is a drug addict dirtbag. How many times did I hear that, right? And that's the kind of attitude from cops you have to fight against. Just because the guy's a drug addict doesn't mean he violated someone's rights. Things like that. So those are the attitudes they bring to it, that even if they sincerely believe in it, they're not doing good things and you have to watch the cop. That's why we have a legal system where defense attorneys can come in and question what the cop did and so forth, and let the juries and the judges decide these things, not the cops. That is vital, that we can maintain that system and the integrity of that system. And the integrity of that system is more important than any disagreement I have about the content of the law.
Let me ask, I'll sort of ask this in a different way. So I'm asking less about the character of particular cops and are they generally honest or not, but more about like, is the way the system is, that given that we live in a society where the police are often tasked with enforcing preventive laws, and maybe they're even discouraged from going after those rapes and murders, or rapes and batteries that you're waiting to prosecute. I know maybe I watched The Wire a bit too much, but are you familiar with like controversies over the last 10, 15 years of like just many untested rape kits came to light, where like the people reported rape, so they were going to the police, as people say. They say go to the police. They did. The police tested them, maybe begrudgingly, but they did, and then stored the kit away, KIT away. They never investigated further, and the numbers are like mind blowing. It's like tens of thousands, 100,000 of. I mean, maybe I don't know. So, are you familiar with what I'm kind of picking up?
Much.
And what are your? Go ahead.
When I give you the specifics on the DNA, for example, when I became a DA, we didn't have DNA. DAs, we had blood typing, which was, helpful. We could tell whether the blood type was AB, ABO, and that can at least give you some probabilities there about who did it. But DNA, which can really zero in and specifically identify. The first thing that happened, we had to learn the science of it. And as a DA, that's one of the fun things. You're always learning new forensic science. One of the things that made it a fun job. Then we had to develop a database. It took us years. Every time a person is arrested on a felony or convicted of a felony, they have to submit DNA. And now their DNA is part of this master index of DNA being collected on criminals. It took us years to develop an adequate database that would actually be helpful to, zeroing in on criminals. So part of that was simply getting DNA on board, developing a national database of DNA that we can compare it with. I'm a huge fan of the Innocence Project, where they're going back to murder and rape cases where there was some DNA or might have been some DNA that was not tested or didn't have the advantage of a national DNA database, which was really the important thing to get online. It's only in recent years, it seems to me, that we've been able to do this kind of thing with great effect. We have a large database of DNA, and we can just plug in the DNA now and see if that DNA is there. Before DNA, there were innocent people, and not all prosecutors had the same standards I brought to it. And they were emotionally able to convince juries that someone had committed a rape in particular, and they turn out to be innocent. And the new DNA evidence shows that the person never committed the rape. And so I'm a big advocate, even though I was a prosecutor, I'm a big advocate of the Innocence Project, because I know that a lot of prosecutors didn't have my ethical standards.
So when it comes to all of those untested cases, like untested rape kits that came to light, are you saying they had nothing to investigate? They didn't have the technology?
Well, honestly, it varied from district to district. In some districts, they didn't even take an effort when this database started developing. And that is irresponsible. They should have had the resources to go back and say, hey, we now have rather conclusive evidence on cases. Like I say, especially rape cases. And murder cases are so important. They should all be tested if there's new DNA evidence. But a lot of rape, but really you could see why in a lot of rape cases this was the case. Other jurisdictions were more aggressive about it. Some jurisdictions were less aggressive, and they really should have been more on it.
Okay, I mean the sort of impression I get, admittedly, as someone who's not plugged into the whole world of investigation and prosecution, is just that we live in a time where the police, at an individual police officer level, as well as the police department level, as well as just the interests of the forces that be in the community and the city, they're incentivized and motivated to clean up the streets when it comes to drug dealers, and they're not particularly interested in investigating rape complaints. And that's where all these untested cases
we have a whole new issue today. And in recent years, we have DAs who've been elected in New York City and Los Angeles, for example, who have refused to prosecute and have their own. See, we have limited resources as prosecutors, and so we cannot prosecute every single violation. And so there's such a thing called prosecutorial discretion. And it goes down to the cop level. If a cop is on the beach, say on the 4th of July, and sees people with cans of beer on the beach and say you're not supposed to have cans of beer on the beach, and the cop says, hey, this is the 4th of July, I'm going to look the other way on the cans on the beach. We call that police discretion or prosecutorial discretion. In recent years, that has been stretched to the straining point as the New York Manhattan DA and the Los Angeles DA have decided that we are not going to prosecute crimes of violence, serious crimes, certain kinds of crimes that used to be, and then the bail rules have changed in many jurisdictions that don't allow criminals to be kept in custody pending real serious cases of violence, where the person should obviously have bail set or be kept in jail to protect the public in the meantime. See, I don't regard the job of a prosecutor as destroying evil everywhere it exists in the world. I was there to protect the innocent, to protect the rights of victims, and when you succeed in a prosecution, don't mean to boast again, but I was very successful as a prosecutor. And every time you get a guilty verdict, it's not a, hey, jump for joy, we got this guy. No. It's just a relief. This bad guy is now off the streets. I can now face the victim and say, this guy's going to get some justice. It's a relief. It's not a joy, is the way I would basically describe it. As much fun as I had as a trial attorney, because there was a lot of fun for me, frankly, the end result is basically just relief. But a lot of the focus change going to, I mean, local prosecutors in LA and Manhattan these days will care more about their leftist social crime issues than they will about real crimes of violence. And so we have horrific cases now in the last couple of years, especially where people who were arrested on violent crimes only to get out and then commit some horrific murder or some horrific rape. The news in America today has been about that poor 43-year-old woman who got beaten, left unconscious, and raped and robbed by someone who had already had sexual assault offenses on his record and probably shouldn't have even been out. That is outrageous. I'm glad I'm not a prosecutor these days, because that would fill me with such frustration to see someone that I'd charged just be let out of prison the next day to go rape and kill someone a few days later. That would be so frustrating. I'm not sure I could handle being a prosecutor these days.
No. So you mentioned prosecutors are not acting on the evidence, like they're not pressing charges. They're not moving the case forward. But I mean, do you think there is a validity to the claim that a lot of the evidence is simply not even reaching that level? It's not even reaching the prosecutors because the police, they're just not particularly interested in catching rapists or rape suspects. They're much more interested in drug dealers.
No, I would say that in the vast majority of cases, the police departments are frustrated because the prosecutors can't or won't prosecute as they used to. And this is causing incredible demoralization among law enforcement across the country. A lot of people are retiring early, quitting from their jobs as police officers because they're getting nowhere. If you're more concerned, like the Manhattan DA, about environmental regulations than you are about people getting murdered and raped in Central Park, then there's a huge problem with the DA priorities, and I don't think that's shared by, for example, the New York Police Department.
Mm-hmm. And is the war on drugs playing a big part in sort of confusing the cops in terms of like what matters to them and what the community expects of them to prioritize?
Absolutely. They spend one of the main problems with local law enforcement, although we are the ones who prosecute most of the murders and rapes, there's a huge problem because we also prosecute a whole bunch of the drug cases. And cops regard when I was a prosecutor, I started as a prosecutor, marijuana was not yet legal in most states. And there were cops out there who thought that someone who, bought a couple joints was an evil being, just like a person, say, who committed theft offenses. I did not share that same view. I'm proud to say that I helped start the first drug court. When I was able to specialize at all in drugs, it was in order to create non-incarceration treatment alternatives for people charged with drug offenses. And I was very proud of being part of that. I don't believe in coercive treatment, but at least giving a non-incarceration alternative, a treatment alternative to these cases, I thought was a step in the right direction. Mm-hmm. And it turned out to be a step in the right direction toward liberalizing drug laws. So you can do good, and you are making moral decisions as a DA, no question. Now, getting to the cops, a huge percentage of our resources go into drug law enforcement. We could double, half the people in prison are there for drug laws. We could double the effectiveness of law enforcement simply by legalizing drugs without hiring a single new cop. Think of that. And more than that, there's a whole raft of crimes that occur, as I say, simply because drugs are illegal. People will steal to support their drug habit, for example. And a whole range of other crimes that are the byproduct, and simply the byproduct, of our war on drugs.
Gang culture in the inner city. That's just a way of life. You're born in the inner city. You basically, you can join a gang and you need to do horrible things to prove yourself vicious
Oh
enough to
yeah.
join this gang,
Oh
or
yeah. You
you're
got to kill
a
someone or
victim,
commit an armed robbery just to get into the gang, or rape someone to get into the gang.
or kill someone you love can be one of the criteria to just to show
Horrific.
them how ruthless you are. I mean,
Exactly.
or you
All
cannot
we're
do
doing
that,
with
and
drug laws is subsidizing organized crime and gangs. An unemployed young person will not be able to afford a $600 gun unless he has the profits coming in from something like drugs.
yeah.
That I saw over and over and over again.
Mm-hmm. So legalizing drugs not only would help prevent, the overdoses vis-a-vis fentanyl you mentioned, but I mean, in incalculable other ways, would clean up the streets
Countless
and
other ways.
it's
Between the
impossible.
1920 after the 1920s, when America had prohibition and tried to outlaw alcohol, crime in America had been declining until the 1920s significantly. America was getting safer and safer until the 1920s. When prohibition laws came in, organized crime exploded, and there was a crime explosion for the next few decades. Even a couple of decades after the elimination, organized crime had been infused and pumped with huge resources, millions of dollars. And that's what our drug laws are doing, are making the worst, rather than those profits going to drug companies or pharmacy companies, those profits went to thugs and criminals who would, break the kneecaps or just execute their enemies.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mentioned The Wire. Have you seen Boardwalk Empire and or The Wire?
No, I'm not familiar with those, but I've heard about those.
Mm-hmm. So the Boardwalk Empire is a wonderful show taking place in Prohibition. And you see all the different gangs. And that's a time when the different communities, the Italians, the Jews, the African Americans, suddenly what race you were really mattered. I'm not to say there was no races. But now it's like you'd better galvanize with people who share your heritage. And it became an economic, and of course, the increasing regulatory state also gives you reason to galvanize and have a community now asking for subsidies and favors and to lobby. So it's absolutely sad to see what took place in the 20th century.
You nailed it. The prohibition laws simply subsidized the Al Capones.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we end up doing. And there's all kinds of negative effects that emanate from that all over the place. And the fact is, drug laws are not proportionate in the way they're enforced. If you're a middle class person with a drug addiction, you're doing it at home in the safety of your private home, and the cops are less likely to get you. If you are poor, you're more likely to be doing it on the street or be doing it in places where the cops are going to get you. And so poor and minority groups are disproportionately affected by drug laws. And that's just built into the system.
Yeah, so there is an element of truth when people say, "Oh, like we have systematic racism and the war on drugs is racist." I mean, they're not entirely wrong, because if you're black in a predominantly black neighborhood, there's a good chance the cops are just driving in circles looking for somebody to search. Whereas if you're if you're in an affluent neighborhood, chances are you can sell pills and sell drugs and buy it and from your friends. Your parents keep it in their cabinet. It's like, it's much easier to get away with it.
In the 1990s, the feds passed laws that were draconian federal drug laws that required mandatory minimum sentences, not just for crimes of violence, but for nonviolent crimes like drug laws. And so people, for their first, cocaine offense, would be put away for decades. And one of the, I'm always harassing Donald Trump for the monster that he was as a president. I am not on Team Trump at all. But one of the few things that I really liked that Trump did was actually his approach to criminal justice reform in this area. He got people out of prison who were basically there for nonviolent drug offenses. And turns out a great many of them were minorities. The same kind of criminal justice reform that Obama, interestingly enough, had advocated, but never actually did.
Mm-hmm. Although to counter that, I believe back in the 80s or maybe in the early 90s, Trump took out an ad in, I think, the New York Times agitating for the death sentence for a handful of youths accused of murder, and they were later found innocent. So Trump, yes, he went the extra mile to try and give the death penalty to people who turned out to be innocent.
And the death penalty is a very controversial thing. In justice, of course, if someone premeditatedly kills another person, the just thing would be to do the same to them. I believe in proportionate justice. the punishment should be proportionate to the harm you caused, especially if it's an intentional or deliberate harm you caused. On the other hand, allowing the state to execute people is also a terrifying prospect. Unlike, say, a 10-year prison sentence, it's horrible to take 10 years away from someone's life, but at least I can give them, $50 million at the end of it to try and compensate for it. When someone dies, there's no way to even partially make up for or give restitution for that. That's a permanent decision. Now, so far, since the Supreme Court has given us back the death penalty, they have not yet found a specific case, where through the Innocence Project or through DNA, where someone was executed who hadn't committed the crime. But there may well come a point where we're going to find that, yes, in recent decades, we have executed someone where the DNA evidence would have shown that they were innocent. And that is not a possibility to dismiss lightly, in my view.
So do you agree with Ayn Rand? I think her view was, like, on principle, it's right to kill a killer or to kill a murderer, but to give that kind of power to the state with the possibility of error and or corruption is just giving them too much. You agree with that, more or less?
Well, like Ayn Rand thought she did kick it to the philosophy of law. She said this is a matter of philosophy of law, but she outlined the ethical and moral principles involved and the epistemological issue involved. And I agree absolutely with her general analysis of that. But let me give you an example that might make it clear. If a person tortures another person, let's say I slowly, torture you over the course of a day or two, wouldn't the proportionate and fair punishment be torturing me? Should the state be allowed to slowly torture me the way I slowly tortured my victim? No. That would be a power that the state should simply not be able to exercise. There are other ways to accomplish proportionality in those cases, right? Give them a life sentence if necessary.
Yeah, we've evolved from the eye for an eye and sawing off people's arms. Our clause against, or our amendment against cruel and unusual punishment is an advancement in law.
Definitely. Cruel or unusual, which has been interpreted to mean disproportionate. And by disproportionate, we mean proportionate, but within the parameters of what is safe for the state to do. So in other words, should we try to give the torturer, as best as we can, approximate the equivalent or even more than he dished out to his victim? Yes. But should the state be allowed to, put people on the rack? Or should the state be? And so it's that category that I put capital punishment in. Does it make sense?
Yeah, I think so. Now, in a proper society, what do you think prisons would look like? I know it's a gang ruled environment. Again, I think racism becomes like a defining force in the culture within prisons. Of course, everyone's in a gang, and often race has a lot to do with it. And there's a lot of rape, a lot of abuse, some murders, in fact, and just terrible. What do you think prison? And now some would say, hey, look, they committed the crime. They let them fend for themselves. And others would say, no, even when you're found guilty in a proper court of law, you still have certain rights. So, how do you view today's prison situation and vis-a-vis what it should be?
I am in absolute distress at the state of American prisons. I think they're way overcrowded because we have way too many laws in the first place. And that's part of the problem. I think that the gangs on the outside are what create the gangs on the inside, by and large. And that has to do, again, with things like the drug laws and black markets that exist out there. And so, the racial tribalism that exists in street gangs is perfectly reflected, as you might imagine, in the culture within prison. Rape is extremely common. Abuse and violence is extremely common. Corruption is extremely common in state and federal prisons. There's no question about it. Now, it should be a punishment. We're taking away your freedom. It's not like you're going to a country club here, or a 4-star resort. So it should be a punishment. On the other hand, the punishment should not involve the equivalent in effect, torture, coming from other prisoners or the system itself. And in order to do that, I think part of that is really a resource thing. We're just taking on way too much, putting way too many people in prison who shouldn't be there, and because of the gangs on the outside and the black markets on the outside, that's increasing the problem on the inside. I believe in determinate sentencing so that there's a regular, objective, expected outcome for certain fact patterns, and it should be the same, at least within every state, so that you know it's objective and fair and equal for everyone. And one of the great sources of inequality in the punishment is how people get treated in prison. Some people are gods because they're on top of their racial gang, and other people are badly abused. That is not proportionate punishment.
Yeah. So is it that the gangster culture from the streets makes its way into prison, or is it that just this kind of emerges in the sort of anarchic state of prison because it's a bunch of people left there with no way to get out, and all you can really do is just band with people who look like you and start to try and push people around?
Well, I'd say there's a little of both. I'd say that when you're in a desperate situation like prison, and you're talking about largely unconceptual mentalities, these people are going to act on the perceptual level and probably gravitate to the place they feel most tribally at home. These are emotionalists. These aren't highly conceptual people, long-term thinkers. That's why they're criminals. They're doing stuff, even drug addicts, for example, drug dealers, they're doing self-destructive things. So it's not like the prison population itself isn't naturally going to break down in irrational, tribalistic ways. And we're talking about people who are desperate and violent. That sort of problem, I think, can be handled by reducing the prison population and adding resources. On the other hand, the way it does come out in prison is a reflection of the gangs on the outside. It really, really is. And so the Crips and the Bloods, for example, will have their even though they're two African-American groups of gangs, they will have their equivalents on the inside in prison. And those are the big ones, because getting stuff in and out of prison is a lot easier than many people realize. Drugs are being used, weapons are being imported into prison. And that stuff comes from organizations outside. Outside organizations can feed in to the drug sales that are going on within prison, or the weapons that are being used for violence in prison. And it is the outside culture that I would say is the dominant force, if that makes sense.
And white guys in prison are not too concerned with political correctness.
No,
they'll band together as white supremacists.
Well, a lot of white guys who are not white supremacists will simply gravitate. And I've heard this story many times. I'd go to the state prisons and do these parole hearings on lifers, coming up for parole, and many of them reported just that. Look, I'm not a racist. I have no sympathy with white supremacism, but I was tired of getting beat up by the Hispanics and the blacks, so I just went and gravitated to the group of all whites. Now, they were skinheads and they had swastikas on their arms. That didn't make me feel comfortable. But on the other hand, that's where I was getting physical protection. And I had a certain degree of sympathy for that because they're in a very extreme context where they have to shut up and keep their opinions, even rational opinions, to themselves.
So let me ask you about a timely thing in Florida. He who can do no wrong in the eyes of some, Ron DeSantis, took action. So there was a handful of prosecutors, I believe, maybe countrywide. They signed the declaration in the aftermath of Roe v. Wade being overturned. And I think they said, we will not prosecute abortion cases. DeSantis, I think, laid off, or he suspended one of his districts, one of the Floridian prosecutors, and he told the press, we will not let woke people, we will not basically give up our justice system to the woke. Now, obviously, he's using a little bit of a red meat language to excite the audience. But what do you think of them signing that declaration? Is that a normal thing? Is that common? Is that acceptable? Them saying they won't prosecute a particular type of crime? And then what do you think of DeSantis's actions insofar as you're familiar with that story?
Well, in many states, such as California, or excuse me, not California, is not like this. But New York, for example, and Florida are like this. The governor can fire the county DA, even if the county DA was elected by the local county. For example, the Democrat Kathy Hochul in New York could fire the Manhattan DA tomorrow, or fire the Erie County DA tomorrow. And so her complaints about crime really it's the system. No, it's her system, and she's the governor and at fault. Now, with Governor DeSantis on rape laws, I can tell you one thing that would have had me quitting the DA's office immediately. Any thought that I would have any role in prosecuting doctors or women for abortion would have me leave the office. I could not do that. Similarly, for example, I couldn't work for the feds in prosecuting military conscription evasion. So immoral do I regard the draft. So immoral do I regard abortion laws that I could have no truck with it. I would have no participation in any of it. So while DeSantis may have this authority, and on one hand, you can say, well, whatever Florida's law is, as a prosecutor, I'm not going to prosecute it as the elected DA under my prosecutorial discretion. That may be within their prosecutorial discretion. On the other hand, it's your job to enforce the laws of the state. It seems to me that the best way to approach that is to say, I quit. I cannot prosecute the Florida's abortion law. DeSantis has got a 15-week abortion law he wants to get passed in Florida, right? And enforced in Florida, I think. We already have it passed. I'm not sure. But in either case, the law is pernicious. And if the DA cannot enforce his state laws, or if his state's criminal laws contain such evil matters, which I regard as the equivalent of, in effect, slavery, like the draft or abortion laws, they should quit. It's an immoral thing to do. And that would be unfortunate, because then rational and more moral prosecutors wouldn't be doing the job. But look, if you live in a state like Texas or Oklahoma or Alabama or Mississippi or Florida, that's what's going to be the case. Fortunately, in places like California and New York, they're not going to have such abortion laws. But I'll tell you, if my jurisdiction had such laws, I simply couldn't be a prosecutor.
Would
I would
abortion
have no part in that.
Would that have been part of the domestic violence division, or how do you suppose abortion would be categorized? Murder?
No, they would have that probably in a special division, but probably for medical regulations. You know, is like a cop, or like a hospital or a doctor doing something intentionally wrong. They would have it, you know, in the business and professions code type prosecutions. I think it'd probably be in the general pool of prosecution at first, but then of course over time they'd probably develop a specialized unit for fetus rights or something division of the DA's office, which would be utterly terrifying to me. That they would, at least that would allow some prosecutors like me to avoid the division, but it would corrupt the entire office in my system. And I honestly would have a hard time working for an office that did such a pernicious thing.
All right, a few super chats. Nick with $9.99, thank you. Bonnie with 99 cents, thank you. Bonnie with $2 says, I suspect I know the answer to this. She asks, did you ever see the guilty go free?
All the time. We have the principle of our system basically says it's better for 10 guilty men to go free than to prosecute one innocent man. Now think about that. We do have a system that requires in criminal cases that I had to prosecute, according to the United States Supreme Court, the prosecutor has the burden of proof. He has to prove each and every element of the offense, and he has to prove that the dude that he has accused did it beyond a reasonable doubt. Now think about what that means. You may think the guy's probably guilty after you've heard all the evidence. He's really probably guilty, very guilty. But do you have a doubt that's not an arbitrary doubt, as we objectivists call it, but a doubt based in the evidence? Even if it's just a doubt, even if it's just a rational possibility, a non-arbitrary possibility, you must vote not guilty. You think, he's probably guilty, 80, 90% chance he's guilty. But there's this piece of evidence that it makes it non-arbitrary that he might be innocent. You are a not guilty vote. And not only is the burden of proof that high in a criminal case, it has to be a unanimous verdict from the jury. So everyone on the jury has to agree there's rational certainty that this guy is guilty. Even if I think he's probably guilty, I have to vote not guilty if that's not the case. Wow. That necessitates, in effect, that many, many, many guilty people go free. But we, as I say, we have a system that says better that an innocent person, or better that a guilty person go free than any innocent person get wrongly convicted. And it's an attitude in general that I have sympathy with, because that will be the effect. Although that's not my goal. I would try to minimize the effect of that. But on the other hand, the truth is that compared to criminals, the violations of rights committed by governments in human history are the comparison is it's the governments that have done 99% of all the rights violations in human history. It's your Hitlers, Stalins, dictators who are the ones who are the major, compared to local criminals. Local criminals are pikers. So my greater fear is the government when it comes to rights violations than any particular criminal. That's the way I put it.
But we're not anarchists, of course. So we're not.
Certainly not.
So, yeah.
And so I thought so being a DA is like I say, it's one of the, like police, courts, DA, the army. Those are some of the valid functions that even we objectivists think should happen. And not that just valid, but vital and important functions. I saw myself as a DA as making possible other people's peaceful activities. I was creating an environment, a non-coercive environment where people could voluntarily interact with some peace and security from violence and force, creating the context in which people could do business, lead their private lives in peace and security and freedom.
Yeah. We're running out of time, but yeah, like I see a lot of like anarchist premises in the culture more by each and every day. Definitely, I think probably the defense attorney culture, the sort of civil libertarian view.
The whole defund the police movement. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, those guys are, I think they're an embarrassment even to the average probably defense attorney, but even just among like, well-meaning civil libertarians, ACLU types, et cetera, like they're, as much as they're doing a lot of great work to protect the innocent or to protect due process, even when it comes to the guilty, they seem to have this view a lot of the time where like government is inherently corrupt. So any way we can screw the government and prevent them from putting anyone behind bars is a good thing. But of course, we have a view that there is a proper role of government. In fact, it's something we can't live without as humans. A couple more super chats. Marilyn with $2. Thank you. Not Another Guitar Channel with 10 Australian dollars says objectivism kicks a lot of things to the philosophy of law, which makes James Valliant's expertise so valuable. Are you a philosopher of law, or are you a lawyer who worked as are those two the same, or are those two things different?
No, they are. No, being a philosopher of law is a definite field of study, of science. Being a lawyer, the practitioner within the existing law. I would make the distinction there. I was a practitioner, but being a student, my undergraduate degree was in philosophy. I studied philosophy straight from Dr. Peikoff himself. And so I myself, in fact, I had discussions with Dr. Peikoff in his home about philosophy of law. And he would always say, look, don't quote me. This is a specialized subject for me, but I'm sure this is interesting to you. Let's think through some of these problems. For example, I had a discussion with him about the exclusionary rule. I had a discussion with him about death penalty. There were even particular cases where I could change the names to protect the innocent and get his opinion. So I'm very much interested in the philosophy of law. There are good philosophers, good legal thinkers, theorists, and good philosophers working on the subject. I recommend the work of Professor Tara Smith highly on this in this subject. But am I in my own private capacity a philosopher of the subject? You bet.
Okay, and I wanted to ask you about Peikoff's O.J. Simpson lecture, but we truly are out of time, so let's bookmark that. At 7 p.m. UK time, in 1 minute, it's the premiere of The Briefly Objective with Razi Ginsburg on Who Owns Football. Then at 10 p.m. UK time, it's TV Talk with Mark Pellegrino, Jax Schumann, and Jennifer Buoni discussing the TV show The Bear. I've heard legend of a bear showing up at an objectivist event in the 90s. Maybe you can tell us that story someday if you were there. But we're out of time. Thank you, James, for a wonderful conversation. Talk again soon, I hope. Thank you, everybody. See you back next week for the Daily Objective, and goodbye.